Well, the character and the content of this convening remind me that I am in Silicon Valley, and it's a great pleasure and luxury to be here. I'm going to be talking to you today about things that you might look at my resume and think that I have no reason to be here to talk about education data science and data ethics. I'm a sociologist. I study complex organizations, and I am specifically interested in post-secondary colleges and universities and the organizations that serve them. One of the special features of higher education in the United States is that it is an extraordinarily varied organizational space. We have at least 5,000 post-secondary organizations that offer some kind of degree. We have ever larger proliferation of organizations that serve those colleges and universities. And we have, as many of you know, a growing proliferation of other entities that aren't schools that provide educational products and services, which means that there are lots of different organizational types, and every time you cross an organizational boundary, an ethical puzzle gets raised, because different organizations purvey different identities, they have different priorities, they're subject to different kinds of rules and regulations, they have different normative traditions and customs. And so as this field evolves and becomes more plural, organizational questions, I think, come to take the form often of ethical ones. For better or worse, I was here at Stanford at the height of the MOOC phenomenon. Does this work? That does not work. This might work. There we go. And I want to just I give you a highly edited timeline just to kind of refresh your memories if any of this has dimmed in the aftermath. MOOC mania is something I can assure you nobody planned. It happened, and how it happened actually is a very interesting story that a sociologist at UC Berkeley, Ben Gebremedin, here at Stanford now, is actually telling in his doctoral work. I got on the bus somewhere around here, for better or worse, and like I said, and worked with MIT to co-host a gathering at the Asilomar conference grounds in Pacific Grove, California. And why did we do that? We did that because in 2012, when MOOCs fell out of the sky, they created what at the time seemed to be a very complicated problem. For those of us who wanted to do research with massively open online course data, and there were a lot of people who wanted to do that. And on both coasts, in both Cambridge and Palo Alto and Berkeley, shall we say, there were these big puzzles that the legal offices of our universities were very flummoxed by. Were MOOC data student data? Were MOOC learners students? If they were students, then they were subject to a bunch of FERPA regulations and other kinds of scrutiny. Were they consumer data? If they were consumer data, then a whole different body of law applied. Were they research data? If they were research data, then we were talking about human subjects, and we have a tradition of giving human subjects to consent to something before we study them. And whose data were they? Because many MOOCs, as were and still are, being conveyed by multiple organizations. So was a Stanford MOOC conveyed on Coursera's course, or was it Stanford's course? And this raised a lot of problems and gummed up a lot of efforts to do research. And so I worked with Susan Silby, a sociologist at MIT, to convene a meeting to talk about that. And we modeled that meeting specifically on the Asilomar conference on recombinant DNA that the Stanford professor, biologist Paul Berg, convened in the 70s. And the purpose of that convening, as some of you know, was to have a scientific peer review on what would constitute a responsible practice in advance of the sequencing of the human genome. And we made a fairly audacious comparison to that historically very important convening, but it's also the case that Asilomar is cheap and on the beach, so it's an easy way to get people from Boston to come out and talk to you for a couple of days. And in the space of 2 days, we created a 1.5-page document, which still is available online, called the Asilomar Convention for Learning, Research, and Higher Education. And one of the main things we argued in that document was that massively open online course users were not students. They were learners. Students have a financial relationship and a legal relationship with universities that comes with special rights and responsibilities, and colleges and universities have responsibilities to students as well. Colleges and universities almost surely have responsibility to learners, but those responsibilities are different, we argued, than the ones that hold to students. And by no means do we take any credit for the proliferation of the word learners in this ecosystem, but I'm very glad that that distinction has been made, because learner encompasses a much larger population of persons and relationships. So I think we were on the right bus in that regard. And as I said, that convening was explicitly about defining learners. Now, turns out, in comparison with students, learners are tiddlywinks, all right? By which I mean, if someone is interested in the ethical, legal, organizational, and financial issues involved in studying students, one enters a much more complicated organizational quagmire than if one is talking about learners. And here I'm going to make a clear distinction between two sides of the 18-year-old divide. I'm going to talk about students who are legally minors and and parents have jurisdiction over them, and students who are adults, right? And that may seem like a false distinction from a learning science or pedagogy point of view, but from an organizational and political point of view, it's really important, because the ethical and political landscape of data describing people who are officially children is an even more complicated domain than the one I'm talking about today. So the Asilomar discussions were really about students who are legal adults, although I think many of the things that I'm going to suggest to you today apply conceptually to students who are children. But those of you who are doing learning analytics with people who are officially children, shall we say, have a much more complicated challenge ahead of you. So we convened another meeting at Asilomar. This time I did it with an organization on the East Coast called the Ithaca Group. And the idea here was essentially similar to what we had done with MOOC Mania in 2014, which was, as instruction is increasingly becoming digitally mediated, and as the cost and ease of integrating different kinds of information describing students on our college campuses becomes ever easier, what are we going to do with the normative and ethical traditions that we inherit from an era of paper records when we apply them here? And I want to say also, I'm not trying to be a frowny face ethicist here. I'm trying to be a smiley face ethicist. Like, we have this whole new realm of opportunity, right, ahead of us, and we're going to talk about a lot of that today. But we're also educators, and because we're educators and we work in these things called colleges and universities, we inherit a set of responsibilities from the 20th century that need to somehow be made to apply to this brave new world, but we're not clear about just how those traditions from a prior era are gonna apply. So think of this as a smiley face question mark kind of investigation. And again, I think we were on the right bus, because in my mailbox, I picked up my copy of the EDUCAUSE review, and they talk about something called the Student Genome Project. So clearly we're not the only ones who are understanding the sort of formal similarities between recent but earlier scientific revolutions and the questions they raise ethically. So I want to spend a few minutes, and I want to make sure and have about 10 minutes at the end of my allotted 30 minutes so that we can have an exchange. So Josina's going to make sure that I'm going to talk kind of fast, but then we'll have an exchange subsequently. And I personally find this domain not only normatively important, but intellectually just fascinating. And I hope I can sort of share some of that enthusiasm with you. I want to talk about two facts. one example and leave you with 5 questions. Okay? Fact 1. Again, in higher education, but most of this applies across the educational spectrum. There is no default platform, right? Once upon a time, there were things called classrooms. They were our default platform. They're physically and temporally bounded locations. They're extremely expensive to pull off. You think about the opportunity costs that are represented by all of us being in this room at this time, at the same time. They exist in nested jurisdictions, right? If this were a classroom, it would be under the governance of the School of Education, which would be under the governance of the university, which would be under the governance of the state of California and the federal government. And over a long period of time, a set of sort of practices and routines would have been developed for how to think about this classroom relative to those other jurisdictions. And a classroom implies special sovereignty over content and over the evaluation of instructors. This is what teachers mean when they say, it's my classroom. In my classroom, right? My classroom. Think about the deep presumption of ownership and propriety that inheres in the notion of a classroom being owned, at least partially, by a single instructor. Okay? And that kind of worked in the spatio-temporal space of a 20th century classroom because class began and class ended and the door opened and the door closed, and you could imagine a classroom being owned or rented by somebody for some period of time, right? And then, but now we live in, we've got this nifty thing called the web. The web does not entail physical or temporal boundaries, right? It's actually designed to break down temporal and spatial boundaries. It commingles multiple jurisdictions whose relations are now being negotiated. It's my classroom, but you might be watching it in your bedroom, right? So what are the boundaries between my classroom and your place of instruction? And it applies no particular sovereignty over content and instruction. I can tell you not to copy and paste from my digitally mediated course, but there's really no way that I can prevent you from doing that. And in fact, I might actively encourage you to disperse the stuff that I've created for instructional purposes as wide as possible. So now we live in a world in which these things are simultaneous and often commingled, right? So we're doing both at the same time, right? At the same time that we have a set of rules and routines that applies to physical classrooms. Fact 2 is the academic record is being remade. Yesterday, each person had one official college record, right? The schools held those records exclusively in trust and by law into perpetuity, and available data for comprising records were very thin, and they were controlled by particular organizations. So Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota has an official record of my getting a B- in medieval art history in the spring of 1987. And if anyone wants to dispute my grade in medieval art history in the spring of 1987, by law, Macalester College is obliged to provide written documentation of that credit and grade. Now, I'm pretty sure that's all Macalester knows about my academic experience in that class. I mean, I could ask the retired instructor for a personal memory of me, but my guess is that the only written trace of my interaction in that class is that B-. Well, today, of course, there's a rapid proliferation of academic providers and mechanisms for recording accomplishment. And we love that. We love our LinkedIn learning profiles. And we love our digital lockers, right? And we celebrate all of those things. Schools have lost their cartel on records generally, but retain their obligations over their own students' records. So Stanford is obliged, Macalester College is legally obliged to defend that B- into perpetuity. LinkedIn has no corresponding legal obligation to defend that B- if I happen to post it on my LinkedIn profile. So it's not clear anymore, at present colleges and universities retain ground truth on records, but it's not clear how long that ground truth is going to be made. And of course, perhaps most important, available data for comprising records are rich and varied and complex and can be integrated with other data, right? So perhaps there's some relationship between my B- and how many times I went to the cafeteria and how many times I went to the gym and what my grades, what my coursework or what my athletic schedule was at Macalester. You can laugh at that one. There was no athletic, right? But there would be no way in 1987 to tie that grade with any other sorts of information. But again, of course, now we love the fact that we can integrate any information we have on when students go to the bathroom, right, and what their nutrition count might be in the library, and when they were last seen swiping into the athletic center. Yes? I didn't say that. I don't know the answer to that other than to say that they don't have the same legal requirements to verify data that a college or university does. Okay, one example. Have you seen this before? Somehow this thing managed to get itself into most of the classrooms at most of the most selective colleges and universities in the country. Almost overnight, right? This is one of several LMS systems. We just presume are in our classroom all the time, all right? And we love this too because we think that this has great opportunities for science, right? And certainly it does, but it raises, again, all of these questions again. Is the material that Canvas is collecting, both in Palo Alto and in Salt Lake City, thank you, is the material that Canvas is collecting, is that part of a student record? Or is that independent of a student record? Is that Stanford's information, or is it Canvas's information? If I'm the student in the class, is it my data? Is it my data? Right? Could I even have my data if Canvas didn't exist? Right? Maybe it's my data and Stanford's data and Canvas's data and the people who acquire Canvas, should it be acquired's data. Right? Again, smiley face, question mark. Right? Because at the same time that these platforms are giving us spectacular opportunities to increase and enhance learning, they're also raising sort of fundamental questions about the boundaries of distinctions between what's mine, what's the school's, what's the company's, what's the shareholders', what's the scientific community's. Right? And if we don't work this out, right, or if we as so we say as a scientific community, if we don't work this out, other people are going to work it out for us. Right? So I'm not raising all of these questions because I want you all to be worried, right, about whether you're doing your jobs responsibly. I'm raising all of these things because I want us all to be actively engaged as a scientific community so that we don't wake up tomorrow morning and find out that the Secretary of Education, with whom we may or may not concur scientifically, has made the rules for us. All right? So I'm offering this to you as a sort of intellectual and organizational challenge. All right? 5 questions. I don't think the current Secretary of Education is going to ask these questions, but I suspect that a subsequent Department of Education Secretary is going to ask these questions, and I would like to have good answers for him and her when those questions get asked by, shall we say, a responsible governor. All right. 5 questions. What data goes on the record, right? What does not, and who decides? Is Canvas part of my academic record, or is Canvas completely distinct from my academic record? Is it sometimes in my record or sometimes not? Who gets to decide that? Whether or not data goes on the record, do educators and researchers have a responsibility to use data in certain ways? And this was one of the main takeaways from Asilomar 2, which was, if as an educator I now know that something I'm doing in my classroom is systematically discouraging, say, women from taking a second course with me, do I then have a responsibility to change my practice? Or if I learn that a certain, the introductory courses in a particular department are systematically dissuading underrepresented minorities from taking a second class in that department, whose responsibility is that, right? So now that I have information, does that change my obligations as an educator and or administrator to intervene in ways that I wouldn't have had before? Now that we know that trans fats, right, are related to heart disease, is there some obligation that I have to change that? Another equally important is, do educators and researchers have a responsibility not to use data in certain ways? Should we decide that there are certain instructional, or shall we say extracurricular environments that should be off limits to academic scrutiny and record keeping? And if there are some that should be off limits, how do we make that distinction and for what purposes, right? One of my favorites is, whose data and records are they, right? Again, the European default is now that they're my data somehow, which I think is, well, I'll just say it. I think it's sociologically facile, right? You can't have data unless there's some entity that is producing those data in concert with you. But we'll probably lose that battle, but you never know. I mean, this is a very different ecosystem here in the United States. And then finally, this is my last comment. We have some time to discuss. Does the language that we inherit from the 20th century enable us to talk about these things productively? Let me tell you what I'm talking about. We have all these words that we use all the time. Oops, there's my Y. Okay, now my friends on the other side of campus in computer science tell me that this one, and this one are fantasies, right? Just forget it. Whatever you thought security, anonymity, and privacy were, just set it aside, right? Transcript, that's my B- at Macalester College, right? That's the thing that colleges have a fiduciary responsibility to cover. This is my favorite, right? Before we can do research on you, we have to tell you exactly what we're going to do, right? And then you have to say, okay, right? This is not designed for we're constantly collecting data about you all the time and we have no idea what we're going to ask in 3 hours, right? So informed consent it does not really work for the environment that we're living in. And then property too is this sort of whose data are they? So maybe we need some new words. And this was one of the things that the Asilomar project was designed to develop. Something like shared understanding, which might mean, well, the data the data describing me are owned by lots of different parties, and maybe I should have some collective sense of what's being done with them. This is, I'll just put them all up here, and I'll just talk about one. One that I have imported from Europe, which I think is actually very important, is the idea of open futures. I've spent a lot of time with education data scientists, and I see lots of smiley faces about predictive analytics and predictive analytics and predictive analytics and personalization and customization, right? I don't hear about tracking, right? Predictive analytics, tracking. Well, from a distance, they look extraordinarily similar, right? So how do we draw the distinction between predictive analytics and tracking? And the idea of open futures, which I've, again, shamelessly borrowed from elsewhere, says in educational contexts, right, predictive analytics should open but never foreclose opportunity, right? That perhaps we should have an ethic which says students get to be different people tomorrow than they were yesterday, and we need to ensure that it's possible for people to be different people tomorrow than they were yesterday. And then the last one I'll talk about is this idea of joint ventures, which I think is a much better way of thinking about what Canvas, Stanford, a professor, and a student are doing together, which is they're all sort of collectively and complexly involved in producing information together. And that we ought to be developing a logic of responsible practice that recognizes that lots of different people are in the places that we used to call my classroom. And we should have a conversation in light of that. I think I'm done. I'll just end with that. Yes. And then we can talk about whatever you want.
Do you have your microphones? Yeah, we have 2 microphones. So.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Josine, you were going to do the honors?
I think Lena was raising her hand first.
I was just wondering if to that interesting combination of words you would add standards, data exchange standards that also facilitate the dialogue about how we talk about data.
We
For
have,
example, IMS Global or XAPIs or things like that.
we have to go there, right? And one of the fun parts about this is that we are in a Wild West moment right now, right? In terms of standards and units. And there's only so much science you can do without unanimity of measures. So, and I actually think that is an existential problem for what we're calling learning analytics now, is we don't have shared units. How that happens in a U.S. polity in which there will be no federal government that tells us how to do that is an interesting question, but I would call that exactly parallel to the things that I'm discussing here. Can I call on Emma in the back? Yeah, thanks.
This is a fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could speculate about how we could change informed consent when we will be collecting data over time and be asking different questions with that, and what sort of information we can provide back to people who have provided that data to allow them to potentially opt out.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. This is we have assembled these resources at a site here that might be of use. In fact, part of the thing we did for the second Asilomar convening was develop some sample messaging. My take, and the take of many of my colleagues, is that we have to essentially replace the whole presumption of consent and compliance that we developed in the 20th century and take a very proactive approach to organizations' relationships with students, much in the way that research hospitals have a fundamentally different data relationship with their patients. We say, if I check into Stanford University Hospital, I sign a bunch of papers, right? I mean, that's important, right, I guess. But the big fact is, I know that there are people who are learning how to be physicians, and I know that all of the data that are being collected for my kidney stones are going into some giant vat of information, right, that other people are going to use to fix kidney stones tomorrow, right? And I would submit that we need a data relationship like that at our universities. Welcome to Foothill College. Foothill College is a learning and research community. As part of our helping you become the best person you can be, you are also helping us help the next generation of students be the best people you can be. And we're going to try and make your education better, and we're going to try and make Foothill better, and we're going to try to make science better, right? It's completely tractable for us to do this. It terrifies the leaders of the most elite and selective universities in the country, because then then we'd have to actually open up our own campuses to systematic scientific inquiry, and that's a high-risk proposition in post-secondary education. But that's personally where I think we should go.
Okay, any more questions? Oh.
I'm just thrilled to be in this company. I actually spent like 15 years in industry with adult training.
Uh-huh.
We were selling $8,000 5-day classes, extremely high-end classes, very, very intense. So I wanted to offer up that the first time I used the term learner was in the early 2000s, about 2002, because these people that would buy these classes and come didn't want to be students. They did not want to be seen as somebody who was unskilled and needed knowledge and skill. So we called them learners, and so I've been calling them learners for 20 years. So that may be where the term comes from industry. The other thing I wanted to bring up is the universal, GOGI record, if you will, like a university healthcare record. So much of the content that we collected on our learners and customers is really important data about their progress. I mean, we often had people within 6 months go from a $100,000 job to a $225,000, $250,000 job in a 6-month period because of what they attained. So I'm just kind of interested in what the thoughts are about what I coined, a GOGI record: andragogy, pedagogy, technical training.
Ah, right. Well, there's a lot of organizational experimentation in that domain right now, right? Again, that's yet another dimension of the Wild West that we're in, right? The other thing that is still highly fuzzy is how returns to these different kinds of GOGI records is going to be assessed by what my colleagues call the market. So that's it's also, there's a regulatory fuzziness, and then there's a sort of employer fuzziness. But, like any Wild West, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk for failure of new products. Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for the
Yeah.
talk. With one of your open questions, it reminded me of something to extend the hospital analogy about if someone has data, should an educator be responsible? Should they be obligated to employ those practices? And I think it calls to mind something that I recall about a study showing that an active learning intervention was more effective for certain groups of people in terms of educational outcomes. And sort of with a hospital analogy, if there was a preclinical trial where a certain drug showed better efficacy in some patient populations, they're obligated to use that drug for the
Yes.
control group. So I think extending that towards your question about should it apply to education, I think is a really good question and should be applied. But I don't know how you can force an educator to implement that. But that's a good question to think about.
I love that. I'm going to hold that for a minute. And I want to make one final comment
Yeah.
before my time is up. But thank you. I'm just going to think about that for a while, and there might be others who have complementary comments or thoughts.
We have 1 more minute. So one short question.
And then I'll take my 30 seconds.
Thank you. You've been talking a lot about data transparency. Okay.
It's
Is that
on.
good?
Yeah.
You've been talking a lot about data transparency and standardizations. I'm curious if different universities want to improve their education, how are you thinking about how all of that data is formatted and more particularly how it's recorded? Because just because a student goes through a course and learns something specific to that course, like maybe the professor really wants to teach machine learning, but machine learning in Stanford might be a little bit different than Georgia Tech.
Right.
And so when you're using those individual terms, how are you thinking about how that data is recorded? Because there's a lot of different elements that come into learning, like
Okay.
Bloomberg's taxonomy and whatnot.
I'm going to connect, in my last remark, your comment to the gentleman here. All right. I love the idea of learning science and education data science. It's a baby little science, okay? We don't, in terms of at the data revolution, right? I don't know what incontrovertibly works, what this treatment incontrovertibly works better than this other insight, right? I mean, it's still a very nascent field, right? And I think it's going to be a nascent field for quite a long time. If we don't solve this standardization and interoperability problem, we are going to stay in pre-adolescence for a really long time, right? So I actually think that the questions of responsible use of data by organizations and the scientific infrastructure we're going to need to get this science to reach maturity are twin sides of the same problem. That's a political and organizational problem. That is not by any means exclusively a scientific problem. Like I said, I'm audacious enough to think that the scientific community should figure out what that architecture should look like. But I don't presume that a scientific community will ultimately build that architecture. So let's keep going
Okay.
with BayLAN. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Right.
much.